There we go. Good to see everyone as well. All right, perfect. We still have a few more folks joining us, but in the interest of time, I am going to kick us off and get us started because we do have an amazing hour planned for you all. So welcome. Today, we are going to be talking about building community virtually. So thank you all for joining us from wherever you may find yourselves. Lee, I see you. We were emailing a little bit. Great to see you. So if you are on the West Coast, East Coast, or anywhere else in between, thank you for joining us. My name is Sandra Garcia, and I am playing a dual role today. And I just absolutely love it when things come together in this way in partnership. And because we are doing this virtually, we want to talk about how we can continue to build community virtually. So I'm here in partnership with two organizations, two companies that I'm very fond of. I am the program project manager for the Diversity and Inclusion Lab for the New York Urban League, but I also happen to be a C-suite coach. So again, playing a dual role today and kicking us off, the conversation will be moderated by Angelina Darasa, who I will introduce in just a bit. And we will be joined in conversation with Dr. Hise Gibson, who Angelina will also introduce. But before we get started, I want to share that the New York Urban League not only has a diversity and inclusion lab, which is a space for brand partners who have made a visible commitment to diversity and inclusion, but we have also created and launched a space dedicated to all of us, which is called NYUL Connect, and it is really a platform to connect. So just like we're connecting now, we can connect on the platform for networking opportunities. The playback for today's session will also be placed and housed on NYUL Connect. It is also a platform for mentoring, to be connected to mentors, to network with other like-minded individuals. Yes, we have New York in mind, but we do know that New Yorkers also love to leave New York and also travel around. So it's a great way to connect with fellow New Yorkers as we're also making our rounds. And so we are going to drop the link to NYUL Connect in the chat, and I welcome all of you to join us there. It is free to join, and not only is it free to join, but we'll also be sharing upcoming programming like this. New York Urban League and C-Suite has partnered to bring you a quarterly C-Suite chat. And we're going to share the topic for those towards the end of our time together today. But for now, I'm going to hand things over to Angelina Darasa, who is the founder of C-Suite Coach and who will be moderating the conversation for today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and happy Monday. This is the best way to start the week because we have so many amazing things to chat about today. Again, I'm Angelina Darasa, and I'm the founder and CEO of C-Suite Coach. We've been around for 8 years, and our mission is to create industry-leading coaching and training experiences to develop talent and foster inclusive and equitable business practices. So we do this through conversation with coaches and executives, as we're having today in part of our C-Suite Coach chats. This is one of the experiences, and glad to partner with New York Urban League on this. Now, I want to introduce you to some of the amazing folks that we're going to be chatting with today. I'll start with Dr. Hise Gibson, who is a graduate of West Point, where he was a member of the Division I Army football team. He has many accolades, including having earned his doctorate of business administration from Harvard University in technology and operations management. Until July of 2021, Colonel Gibson served as an academy professor in the Systems Engineering Department at the United States Military Academy. And he's also established and directed the Systems Decision and Analysis Center, as well as directed the department's core engineering sequence and engaged in strategic outreach as a fellow at MIT. So he's done amazing work, and right now his research and consulting activities have been in the areas of operational effectiveness, leadership, leader development, human capital development. So he is the right person to have this conversation with. Welcome, Dr. Gibson.
Really, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
And we also have joined with us today someone you know well, who wears many hats, and that is Sandra Garcia, who, in addition to working with Urban League, has also been working with C-Suite Coach as a executive coach for the past year as well. And she has many, many accolades as well, including having served as the New York chapter president for the National Association of Multi-Ethnicity and Communications, NAMIC, for 2 years, where she was awarded Chapter of the Year, so award-winning work. She currently is the founder of Encounter Your Potential, where she develops and executes strategies that use marketing as the pillar for achieving business goals and driving revenue. Her client list includes Google, JP Morgan Chase, HSBC Bank Toronto, Vivo, Summit Health, and many, many others. So excited to have Sandra with us today. Welcome, Sandra.
Well, thank you. And of course, the New York Urban League.
Of course. Now, I want to dive into what we're here to talk about, which is building community virtually. Work culture has evolved so much throughout the years. We think about how, even if we look back 50 years ago, work was more focused on being very hierarchical and very formal. What do you think now when you hear the word community as it relates to today's working world? Dr. Hise?
I think that's a great question and a great start. I mean, I think community is a really broad term. And as we think about how we operate in organizations where, if we're honest, have multiple generations inside of multiple organizations, so that definition of what community means is pretty wide. So if I think about some groups who think community only can happen when we're like together in person, where on the other end of the spectrum believe community can be built virtually, as we've all had to do with the past 3 years in ways we did not expect. I would say that it's almost like a hybrid reality. We have to be comfortable in both spaces, and there's different skill sets required to build an effective community that values all of the participants. And that's because all of us want to feel valued. But I think creating that is a lot more work than we like to admit, and requires all of us to be actively engaged. You just can't sit back in the corner and think you're going to have community. And so I really think it's a very active engagement that's required. And I think that we create the community that we want to have based on our individual values or the values of our organizations. And we have to find alignment. And that's requiring organizations to flex, lean in more to this team members and teammates. Is also requiring team members to acknowledge it's not all about me. So everyone's not a free agent. We have to kind of come together, which again is the work. So I think building community is something that we all would like to do, but it requires active participation and not being sidelined.
And I love that you talk about the participation that we need. I'd love, Sandy, if you could dive into, with your marketing hat and also your coaching hat on, if you could talk a little bit about the value of being that active participant in a community at work. How does that offer a more fruitful working environment for everyone?
Yes, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Hise shared. And that's actually one of the things that I noted for self, is that being intentional is so important. You have to be intentional about understanding what are the layers of your community. What are the layers of the communities that need to be built? Finding your people within your organization, finding your organization's people. That's an audience within himself. So as a marketer, I'm always thinking audiences and various different audiences. So you have your audience as an individual. You have your organization's audience. If you're part of a team, your team has an audience as well. If you're in marketing, your audience might be sales. So you got to know who your team, who your audience is there. And then your industry. So Angelina shared that I am a former president for a aggregate group named New York. So who is your industry audience as well? And then getting intentional about what audience you need to tap into and for what and how they can serve you, but also how you can serve them in return. And I think that's all important things that we need to think about from a professional development perspective, career development perspective. That's part of our growth trajectory as professionals.
Really, really great to think about. And I love that you call out the different ways we need to be getting involved with building community. I will say, with everything we might have going on in our day-to-day, it can become really easy to focus just on doing the work. How does having community help elevate the work? And I'd love to hear from Dr. Hise on this. And I have some questions also based on your research. But let's first dive into talking about, how does having a community at work elevate our actual work product?
I think that's a great question around community elevating ourselves. It highlights the reality that most work, I played team sports, obviously, so most work is team-based, or in our current environment, cross-functional team, global teams, diverse teams, is rarely just an individual working on a thing or working on an initiative. It takes, and so the ability to bring in all of the amazing attributes of all of the members of that cross-functional team makes for a better product. We know through research that, having diverse perspectives provides a better product. It's a little bit more than that. That by just saying that means that if I have I'm from Texas, so if I have a bunch of folks from across the U.S. and a handful of folks from, a country outside of the U.S., obviously I'm going to have a better product. No, you can have all of these perspectives and bring in an environment where people feel psychologically safe, valued to say what they want to say, and challenge each other in a respectful way. Then I'm going to get the positive outcomes from that community that brings value not only to the organization, but it creates value to the people inside of that team who recognize that their word, their actions, their contributions are also valued, even if they're not at the forefront of the initiative.
I love that. And I love that you also called out the research aspect of it. I have one quote that's from a paper from Iowa State University, a professor there. He said that by the 1980s, some companies became more intentional about their work cultures. He wrote that organizational culture became a hot topic for research, and he owes that to the notion that culture has a powerful impact on organizational outcomes and success. So when you think about some of the things that you've seen, do you feel that tying culture directly to an organization helps or hurts when it comes to building community in the workplace?
I think it helps. I think organizations, we throw the word we throw the word culture around a lot now, a whole lot, and so recognizing what that really means and kind of figuring out, how do we define the culture? How do we measure the culture? Kind of hard to measure something as soft as culture because the people are the culture. And so it requires leaders to acknowledge and lean in to the people in ways that are very uncomfortable. It causes the leaders to have to recognize that maybe their culture might not operate the way in which they believe it does, which again is uncomfortable, but that's kind of why the bosses wear the big boss hats, so that they have to operate in this constant vague of gray. And I think if organizations don't acknowledge and lean into their culture, they will fail because there's so much transparency in the marketplace that those amazingly talented team members, employees, leaders will walk in ways they hadn't before, like 2019. We're already seeing this trend with the transparency in the market, but 2020 hits, everything has changed and we can't put it back in the box.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that we saw in 2020, when you talk about the words culture and community, is even making sure that those are inclusive spaces when we use that. So I know, Sandra, you and I talk about often the even switch in how companies moved away from cultural fit to thinking about terms like cultural add and the importance of that language. Now, more and more office workers, folks working for big organizations, are saying they value community in the workplace, especially for millennials. From your lens, working with so many leading companies, what can organizations do to attract and retain, particularly millennials, when we're thinking about fostering that community in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I dropped into the chat, culture is what happens when the boss is in there. So for anyone here who's a people leader, whatever your team is doing right now while you're on this Zoom, that's your culture. So making sure that you're attracting talent in regards to culture. First, one, I would go back to what Dr. Gibson shared. You have to figure out where you are. What's the baseline where you're starting from? Secondly, one of your biggest attraction and retention tools is your current existing talent. So what is that sense of belonging? Yes, we throw these words out there. What is the sense of belonging that exists within those who are within the organization? Because they can be either your strongest marketing tactic or your strongest deterrent, because ask a friend, was it like to work there? And they will let you know. So we need to make sure that our internal talent is also looked after, that they feel that the organization is theirs as well, that they're valued, and that will help attract more. Also, you mentioned culture additions. I think that's also important. So making sure that we have inclusive hiring tactics, not just diverse marketing tools and mechanisms that we use, but also what is the strategy before we get to hiring? And that may include your actual people, and that may include these communities that we talk about. So for example, if you do feel like you belong, if organizations do have groups like ERGs, for example, your ERGs can be part of that that inclusive hiring strategy, leveraging them to also connect with other like individuals. We also have communities like NYU All Connect. That is a place that organizations are also using to connect with talent before they can even begin the sourcing process.
So many powerful gems there. And I'm going to go back to that quote of culture is what happens when the boss isn't there. That really resonated with a lot of folks. And, that is part of what people experience when they're looking for the communities that they want to be a part of at work. They're looking to see what is that culture when the boss isn't there. Now, Dr. Gibson, you've worked with a number of leaders in your various roles, and currently as a Harvard Business School professor, you're grooming the next generation of leaders, right? And so I would love to hear from you. How do you work with a leader or a people leader that's been in a seat where perhaps they haven't created the best culture and they want to mend some of the relationships that they may have had some difficulties with in the past? How do you help them mend those relationships? What advice would you give them?
So I love these softballs. So one thing I think about whenever I talk to leaders, especially those who are going through that transition of trying to rebuild the trust that they've lost. If we're honest, especially I'll use like senior leaders today. So if we think about senior leaders today, generally they're pretty amazing, pretty solid, exceptional individuals. And if I always ask them, where were they in 2009, just for context? Because in 2009, we had a very catastrophic situation. And so the fact that they're a leader today means they survived and that they are awesome. But it also means they may not have had the same opportunity to actually develop others because they are so good. They have always been good. And if we think about the last decade of the market generally, you can just fire people and pay more money and pull people. Similar to what happened in the 90s, similar to what happened in every decade up until now. You could always poach amazing talent, meaning go out and find folks, pay a 1.5 times their salary, and you got them. So, but in the current day, as I talk to leaders, because of the need to value teammate members, the culture part of their organizations, and the requirement to go out and find talent is harder, the need to understand how to invest in others and develop people is far more important. And to not only say development, but do development, which is, I don't know, work. You have to like put people in position. You have to recognize they're going to fail. You have to put them in situations where you're not going to negatively impact them if they don't come out on the right end of it, which is hard because the leaders who I'm talking to have been amazing their entire lives. And so they assume everyone is like them. So I always go in with a reality checkup. Everyone's not you. And you need to value people for what their superpower is. It's up to you as the leader to figure it out. Because the person's not going to come to you and say, hey, I can fly. Hey, I can breathe on the water. They're going to work hard and hope is not a method. They're going to hope that you're going to realize what it is. So especially in if I think tech space, finance, they're not, folks just work really hard. And so I try to help them recognize that piece and then talk to them about building trust in a meaningful way. And it's going to take time. It's not having one conversation, having one engagement, having one session is not what building trust is. But they can lose it faster than they can build it. And so trying to make sure they recognize all of these dynamics at play and that they're the executive VP, they're the CEO. So no one cares how you feel. So I also have to remind them of that. when you're leading an organization, you don't have a lot of people to talk to. So, and no one wants to hear you cry about stuff. So also it's almost like a kit glove and a mallet that I use at the same time in a very soft tone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Angelina, can I just add to that?
Yes, please.
So I say there is a strong connection between, the business and what you need to move the business forward with also human capital. The business doesn't move forward without your people. What organizations are used to doing is revisiting their business plans, sales plans, marketing plans, all the plans on an annual basis, but you also have to revisit your people plan. And in the last few years, so much has been going on from a human capital perspective. So I say you have to also revisit, review, and revise as necessary and as needed, and also with an understanding of what your people need. And leadership muscles of 20 years ago don't always work today. So leaders who especially have been leading for quite some time may also need that coaching and that training for new skills in order to be able to lead talent today.
Both such great points. One of the things that really resonated with me is how much individual contributors are often rewarded with management, right? To your point, Dr. Hise, and they are not building management skills, to your point, Sandy. Now, if let's take a leader who needs to get a pulse on the culture. What means should they be going about to do that, to see if community exists in their organizations? What are some tactics? And for those of you in the room, if you could throw in the chat, if you're managing people, how are you getting a sense of what's happening when you're not there? How are you getting a sense of the culture on your team? If you are reporting into someone, why don't you let us know? How do you let your manager know whether or not they're doing a good job of building community? We'd love to see some tactics in the chat. But Dr. Hise, if you could kick it off, how do we get a pulse on the community from a leadership standpoint? What are some tangible ways a leader can check in and know how they're doing in that regard?
I'm laughing only because I'm like pre-iPhone and TikTok. You can check and see what your teammates are like, looking at on TikTok, follow them. if they have a TikTok. Don't do that. I don't recommend that. So one thing, we have all these surveys. So like there's like glint things, they're like fill in the blank survey. And sometimes what leaders do with all these surveys provide are great tools for information to get an idea of what's going on at a specific point in time. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders and organizations will attempt to respond immediately to every part of, let's say, that one of those survey types, either a glint or fill in the blank, whatever it is, which I recommend take a step back, recognize the context. Hey, did you just put out a major announcement before the survey? Did you just have a major a earnings call before the survey? Did you just limit hours before the survey? Because all of these, you're responding directly to the survey will cause you to do a whiplash effect that is not good for the organization. And so using the tools in context is important versus responding to everything, because no matter what organization you're in, there's always going to be someone who's not happy. There's an old adage in the U.S. Army that a person in a role which is a specialist someone is a rank of enlisted 4. That person is between like 18 and 26. That's a range, right? The E4, the enlisted member 4, is going to tell you exactly how they feel. Unstructured, unvarnished, uncensored feeling is going to come from that person. You can't respond to everything that person says because they're going to give you whatever they're feeling at the time. So you have to put everything in context. So I think leveraging the tools is one, having multiple like fireside chats, which I think a lot of organizations are using now to try to communicate information, and then even smaller meetings to receive what, if we think about in 2020, a lot of CEOs went on listening tours to listen what was going on. The question is, you listen, but what did you do following just sitting in a room listening? There's some leaders I know who made organizational adjustments based on what they heard, and others who did not. So you have all of these things, but you can't do one. You actually have to do them all. And you can't do them all at once. You have to have a strategic journey that you've created that's also repetitive.
Oh, that's so many nuggets there, especially that tail end really laid out an action plan for leaders, right? So we want to make sure that we're taking a variety of actions, but also not putting the pressure to do them all at once. And then I also heard, which really resonated, this idea of if you're collecting feedback, do something with that feedback to influence culture. Now, Sandy, in the beginning, you talked a little bit about what we should be looking for when we're trying to see new companies we want to work with, what the culture is in place. When we're seeking jobs, when employees are looking for new roles, what are the questions they should ask early on, even in that interview process, to gauge whether or not the employer is creating a healthy culture and is committed to fostering community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just having questions around culture in general. So add a set of questions. How would you describe the culture within the organization? And maybe not just you, but how would the people that work for you and around you also say it is to work with you? One thing that I look for, because I've been an individual within organizations, is also making sure that what's being placed out externally matches what's happening internally. I've been there where we have these Women History Month and Black History Month activations taking place externally, but nothing was being done internally. So really take a look at what and how your organization shows up, and then ask questions for how that shows up internally. How do you celebrate women internally? How are you celebrating your various different culture groups internally? So those are some questions that can be asked. But really, if you are now, a lot of organizations also have what's it like to work at social media pages? So even taking a look at that to also source some content for questions to ask, but also feel free to ask, can you speak to various different people within the team too, so that you can get a more diverse perspective for the culture from various different people.
That's great. And I think what you called out really just gets to this point that we always need to reinforce, particularly when we have opportunities to talk to people of color who are in the job force seeking roles, is we have agency to interview our employers as well. And we should be looking for cultures that fit us or that we want to be a part of. So I love those questions that you called out. And it also just made me think about when you talk about folks having efforts externally, but not matching those efforts internally, that can just be read as very disingenuous. For an employee who is a part of an organization that they may feel they don't align with the culture. And this question is for you, Dr. Gibson. How do you know when you may want to take action to try to shift that culture? And how do you know when that community or that culture that exists is not the right one for you and it's time to start thinking about planning an exit?
I think that's a great question on how should you think about hanging out and pushing or leaving. And I'll start by reminding everyone I'm from Texas, so I grew up in so there's a callousness that comes from growing up in the South that I don't know if you would call it resilience. I was just at home this weekend. I don't know if it's a resilience or a callousness or just a, shake things off in ways that sometimes are really not productive, but cause you to like go through walls. So you're willing to hang and deal with things longer than you need to. It's similar to whenever I talk to leaders about letting teammates go. If you're already thinking about letting someone leave, you probably should have did it 6 months ago. We always lag because we don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations. So I think ways of recognizing that, hey, what you're doing is valued is one, when you engage in conversation or engage in initiatives, one, you're being heard. So if at least someone inside a leadership arm is like coming into you and asking you questions, you're being valued. That's an obvious thing. Or if you actually see some things that you've highlighted be put into practice, you're definitely valued. So because if we're honest, the squeaky wheel, the dissident, the naysayer is actually needed. You don't need an organization full of like, group thinking. We all think the same. You all agreeable. You need some disagreeable people to make an organization move. Okay. Now, there's positives to that, but you recognize that it is not beneficial when everyone is shutting you down. And unfortunately, and all of us, I'm sure, have experienced this. No matter what age, you always kind of know where you're on the outs. When you're, there's an in group and an out group, right or wrong, and when you're like sitting on a corner on an island by yourself. If you start to feel that, that's about the time that maybe this organizational culture is not aligned with your values, and you need to start thinking about going to a place where your superpower could be leveraged more. And so, but I mean, we all have that inner voice that's telling us you might want to like let it roll, And I've talked to a lot of leaders at different levels and asked questions like, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Because in some organizations, by being effective, you're actually making a broader impact. You're getting no credit, but you're actually like, behind the scenes, providing opportunities to others that you wouldn't ordinarily. And so you're being effective and you're getting over the being right part. The more senior you become, effectiveness beats right all day.
Absolutely. There's a term that I've been using a lot lately when I think about people who are strong and wrong. That's what I call it, and how it is important to think about resolution. And part of building a community is thinking about being effective. You all, please start putting your questions in the chat. I have a couple of more, and I do want to just, because there's a follow-up to what you just shared. Dr. Gibson asked this one question, and then I want to talk a little bit about virtual habits. So Leah asked, do you feel that way about a generally pessimistic person? How can they boost morale when they're a part of the culture?
I'll frame it with pessimism and having intellectual dissonance are not the same thing. So being a pessimist is not helpful to move a team forward. Asking hard questions and asking the team, that sounds great, but what about? And what about? There's a way of doing that is not on the pessimism side of it. I mean, I'm a generally, get her done kind of person and leader. And right or wrong, there's an article at hbr.org that a colleague wrote around the negative effects of come to me with a solution, not a problem. Well, that's the kind of leadership style I've always grown up with. If you're going to bring a problem, you better bring a solution. There's some negatives to that, but it's generally worked. But I'm always open to hearing the other side. Sometimes the pessimist will really jam that in a way that's not productive and actually causes everyone else to come down as well, which is not helpful to the team. So again, there's a difference between being a naysayer, intellectual dissidence, and pessimist, in my opinion.
Yeah, great point of differentiation. Thank you for that. Now, we have covered a lot when it comes to building community and building culture, and thank you both for sharing some of those things there. One thing I recognize, though, is some of what we've discussed applies just as much offline as it does online in these virtual settings that we're in. So I'd love to just talk a little bit more, because we're moving more to these hybrid workforces and virtual environments. Are there some specific tools and tips you all would like to share when it comes to making sure that we're instituting and building communities in a virtual setting if we're working remotely? And I'll kick it off with Sandy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some things that translate from the in-person space to the virtual space. Something that is so endearing to me is a good morning. So I may not be walking into the doors down the hallway, but that sense of acknowledgement to get the day started, small things with big impact. So what are some things you can take from the offline to the online? I have a team member who, no matter what is going on, is always there with a good morning. I think that's lovely. What are ways that you can boost morale? Help drive connection, even when working states and miles away. Those are things that we can all be intentional about. And then we can also look out for when there's behavior shifts. That good morning message didn't come in through ping today. What's going on? So those are things to look out from a culture perspective, and also taking care of your people perspective. But what I also like to encourage people leaders to do, and we're all leaders of ourselves, is also to create space for diverse ways of communicating. There are studies out there and reports that introverts thrived during the pandemic and the lockdown, because there were options for how to communicate ideas and thoughts. The chat, for example, I love it when the chat is going and when folks are present with us via chat, and that's a different form of communicating. Some people may not speak up during a meeting, and we saw that in person, but the chat created space for people to still contribute and to still be present. So also being mindful of that, what are the different communication channels that we're creating for our people to really thrive and to contribute if we are looking for those additions that will not think and process in the same way as everyone else. That could also include maybe delayed thoughts and contributions. If you have a meeting today, if we're having this session today, giving space maybe 2 days later, that window for folks to still, contribute, and also contributing before a big idea is made. So those are just a few, but there are many more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Hise?
I think, Sandy, all great points. The only thing I have to really add is if we think about how we operated during the pandemic, there are ways in which we went into people's lives that we never knew before. So we knew about your dog, iguana, your kids, your family members, your habits, and what we found is that folks actually now expect leaders to know 2 and 3 levels deep of what's going on with them in ways that before would not be accepted. Like, If you come to work, I see you at work, and that's it. You're done. Now folks are more open to sharing and also expect you to care and be interested. In my old line of work in the military, I've always had to know 4 levels deep of every individual, down to their next of kin, where they lived, what their kids did, what their partners did, in ways that, if I'm honest, is pretty doggone intrusive, just generally. But that's part of the culture. That's what's expected. And that's what leaders did. That same almost intrusiveness is what's expected of leaders now. And so I think to Sandy's point around acknowledging the many different ways we communicate, to deal with all the ways of accessibility for information and to leverage that, for leaders to understand, hey, I didn't hear from X today in any of these forums. I need to follow up with them, or call beforehand and pull people in. And then leverage the in-person time in different ways. It's not just to come to a meeting around a table. You better come up with a better idea than that. We better have an awesome play date that, everyone can learn from in a meaningful way, and we can value each other. So it's forcing leaders to think outside the box in ways we didn't have to before. But I think it's powerful, because not to say any of you have done this, but you might have been in a grocery store taking a meeting. Not that you did that, but I might have done that once or twice, and you can still be part of the conversation, even as a silent contributor, and follow up in ways that we couldn't before. Which means your team members and teammates value the flexibility that the hybrid space creates, and so that the slinging everybody back in, depending on what industry you're in, and regulatory requirements, might need to be really thought through. Just generally. And a lot of organizations are grappling with that now.
Yeah, right. And Angelina, if I can jump in, just to feed off of that, another thing that I hear happening often is how time in person is being used, because we're still a little bit more transactional for time in the virtual space. So we jump on at 1 o'clock and we're out of there before 2 o'clock. Whereas, in person, there is the meeting before the meeting, and then the meetings that happen after the meetings. And being back in person is a little strange. So I do see that leaders are using the in-person time to team build and to relationship build, and also for ideation sessions, whereas the virtual time is being used to really move the needle and to get work done. It's still a little bit more transactional, but in person is being used to really develop that culture and those relationships.
Thank you both so much. And I am still just cracking up about the transparency of us taking calls on the grocery store. And it's true. It's as we move into more hybrid workforces, it's work overtakes our lives in many ways. It becomes more a part of our lives. And that increases the burden of leaders to show their investment in their talent by learning about the lives of the people they work with. Now, I want to open it up for questions, because we have some time for Q&A from you all. So please, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we can get those answered. I definitely see some comments. In-person time is loud for me. I can't control or mute the extra sound. That's such a great call out. Yes. So it is good to have that variety and that option. And while you all are compiling your questions, I want to ask this as well. Sandy, you called out and mentioned, for example, different social styles benefiting from hybrid workforces. Have you seen any impact or any research, and this goes for either of you, of how hybrid and remote work is impacting people of color in particularly? So we can start with Sandy and then Dr. Hise.
Yeah. Socializing in the workspace. But one of the immediate things that I think about, which Dr. Hise spoke to earlier, is just having a look into folks' personal lives. That was something that, especially in my work in New York with various different organizations, people were impacted by differently. Everyone's home looks different, and home is not home for everyone. So how you then show up is also different. Are you showing up on camera or off camera? Because at the very beginning of the pandemic, we also didn't have backgrounds in the way that we do today. So that was one that was solved for. I think it's, well, for the most part, solved for in that, we can use backgrounds and we can neutralize our environments. But I do think it also created space for folks to participate and be part of the conversation. So I think about people, for example, with accents. Sometimes it's easier to type in your thought into the chat and to be able to share and contribute without overthinking, are they going to understand me right now? Again, processing time is different for everyone. So yeah, the question may be thrown at me, but I may not be able to come up with a nice succinct response right now to be able to contribute. But while someone else is sharing, I can drop mine in or write it down and then bring myself off mute to be able to share. So I have seen also the evolution of the impact that is had on culturally diverse groups. And what I would say is that for the most part has been for the positive.
And to build off that, I dropped something in the chat around my colleague, Laura Morgan Roberts. She's an amazing researcher and faculty member at UVA, the Darden School, wrote about working while Black in 2020. And so if we think about the front end of the, when the pandemic started, it was benefited because of the almost the luggage that is carried to go into work didn't have to be carried, and you could get on, operate, work, be effective, and then close the Zoom or MS Teams or WebEx. The challenge is the social part, because those are some of the realities of working in any organization, is how do you socialize? And as we think about this movement back to work and back in the office, trying to find a happy medium between getting the work done and the relationship reality of any organization. So it's not just about the corporate game, it's about being a part of any organization. Their social norms, they're being reestablished, and being a part of that just takes time and work. And so it based on who you are, where you are, how you identify, all that comes into play in that socialization. And so the leaders of the organization have to acknowledge that and establish their values and how they want to operate now, which is different than 3 years ago. And it does impact people of color differently. It just does. So to not acknowledge that is kind of like crazy. Like, no, it's different. If we're going to go to a social function and you don't like to play golf, that's a problem, because now you can go outside if you're in Florida and play golf. So you got to think those same old realities are coming back into play. And so it's almost training, developing, reminding a whole new employee base that came in during COVID that, oh, by the way, there's these like things you got to show up to that you don't think, I don't need to do that. I just need to just do my job. Like, no, this is an organization made up of people, and you got to like do stuff and hang out, so that the relationship game caused you to be far more effective. At certain levels, it's all about relationships. Maybe not at the entry point, but by the time you get the manager director stage, who do you know and how do you get things done and get things moved? And it doesn't happen through serendipity.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think what you called out, Dr. Hise, also brings us back to the beginning where we started, which is recognizing that being a part of a community and how you contribute to that community has a direct impact on your outcomes for the trajectory of your career, right? So it is important to call that out. We do have a question in the chat, and this will be the last question from the chat, and then I'll ask you all a closing question. What are your thoughts about when firms are requiring folks to come back into the office? Dr. Hise, take that one.
I got a quick one on that one, because having interviewed a couple of CEOs from a couple of top firms in New York in charge of banks, I remember when he stated he was bringing everybody to the office. Now, some of that is regulatory. Some of that is literally based on the regulatory requirements of, let's say, the SEC. Financial firms work on certain on certain networks that require certain access that you can't get from home. So even during the pandemic, there were folks who were working like, at large financial firms. And so I think depending on the industry, they're doing what they're doing based on some regulatory requirements, and that's allowing them to like slingshot back. That's a small fraction of organizations. The rest are just personal preference. And so, because if I'm the boss, I came up going into the office, I want everyone to go in the office too. Well, that is awesomely flawed in the current environment. And so I think organizations have to figure out, literally based on position, level, and need for the business, and go through each of their positions and determine, does it need to be in, hybrid, or remote? That takes work, but that level of intentionality will make their life so much easier and really help talent development professionals help identify the appropriate talent and delineate who needs to come in and who needs to go out. We know through research about 2 days a week is the sweet spot to be in the office. We know this. It's been studied already, empirically supported, which is why there's no one on the roads on Mondays and Fridays. So just something to think about.
Thank you for that. And we are quickly at our time. This was such a powerful conversation. Now, before I close us out, I just want one in 30 seconds from each of you. Someone once said to me, we all have the power to change the temperature in the room. So when we think about building community, especially in a virtual standpoint, and the role each of us as individuals play in building community, what's your one quick tip on how we can change the temperature virtually and create a better community for each of us at work? And we'll start with you, Dr. Hise, just 30 seconds, and then go to Sandy.
I really think it's all about cadence. So figuring out what your cadence is going to be is the way in which you can build community, and ensuring that you really share, here are the expectations, here are the rules of the game, here's how we're going to do it, and here's the frequency. That's a start, so everyone understands what they can expect.
Thank you. Sandy?
Yeah, I was going to go with C's as well. 3 C's. You stole one of mine. So definitely conversation, but create value, not the surface conversations. Don't give me the coworker response. How was your weekend truly? And then also consistency is so important. Don't do it just on Monday, check in every day, and connect and engage as well as reach out.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your contributions. I know I certainly learned a lot, and you all got some great responses with the things that you shared in the chat. Now, we are closing out, but I want to let you know that there will be more C-Suite Coach chats with New York Urban League this year. So I do hope that you come back, that you bring a friend, and that if you're looking to engage coaching for your organization, that you reach out to us at info@csuitecoach.com to find out how to get your organization and bring executive coaching to you. I'm going to pass it back over to Sandy for some final words from New York Urban League.
Yes, thank you. So we're getting the feedback and the response in the chat. I love chat engagement. So thank you for that. I do look forward to our upcoming conversations. As shared at the very beginning, they will be quarterly conversations. So the next one will be about the benefits of coaching in the workplace. And then we move on to Q3 and Q4. Someone did ask in the chat, what are some community recommendations? And you are at the right place, because not only are we building community virtually today, but we're also encouraging you to join us so that you can also access tidbits and also actions from our conversation today on NYUL Connect. And I'm going to go ahead and drop that link into the chat so you can all join us there. It is free. That is a way that you can definitely connect with all of us. And Angelina, I just have to say thank you for allowing me to play this dual role today. And Dr. Hise, so good to share the floor with you. And I cannot wait to see everyone on May 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.